Hello! As you're probably aware, theists often appeal to arguments from fine-tuning or the existence of consciousness as evidence for God. However, these sorts of arguments are then countered by an appeal to some form of an anthropic principle. The sort of anthropic principle we'll be talking about here is one that either states or entails that if something X is required for making observations at all, then that X is not evidence for or against any theory. So, because a fine-tuned universe would be required for any observations to occur at all, because we need one to exist, the fact that our universe is fine-tuned can't be evidence for any theory, such as theism. Likewise, consciousness is required to make any observation whatsoever, so it can't act as evidence for anything either. So, if this principle is true, then it diffuses the number of arguments for God's existence. But I think this kind of reasoning leads to some pretty, shall we say, interesting conclusions as well. Let's begin by distinguishing between two interpretations of our anthropic principle. It's important to note that we can interpret the principle as either saying that some X is not evidence for anything if it is required for people in general to make observations, or as saying that X is not evidence for anything if it is required for oneself to make observations. We could call the former version the corporate anthropic principle, and the latter the personal anthropic principle. Now, usually, it's not explicitly stated which anthropic principle we're discussing because the two go hand in hand. If something satisfies the corporate anthropic principle, it automatically satisfies the personal anthropic principle. Furthermore, any argument for the more general corporate anthropic principle can simply be parodied into an argument for the personal anthropic principle as well. If it's a good argument to say that this data isn't evidence for any theory because it is required for us to observe anything at all, then it seems that it would also be a good argument to say that this data isn't evidence for any theory because it is required for me to observe anything at all. Why should the former argument be convincing, but not the latter? So these two principles seem to stand or fall together. But the personal version of the anthropic principle has a bunch of crazy implications. As a warm-up, let's consider the fact that my parents met. This would be required for me to observe anything at all, because if they didn't meet, I wouldn't exist. So this fact cannot count as evidence for or against any theory. Perhaps that's not so strange, but let's keep going. If my parents' meeting is required for my observing anything, then the existence of my parents is also required for my observing anything, which means that their parents' meeting is implicitly required for my observing anything as well. We can stretch this as far back as we want, because the parents of my parents' meeting is necessary for my observing anything. As it turns out, my existence depends on a very specific chain of events leading to my conception. And the butterfly effect ensures that even a tiny change in the history of our world would upset this chain and ensure my non-existence. So, pretty much the entirety of history is required for my existence. But, by the personal version of the anthropic principle, if the past unfolding the way it did is required for my existence, then the past unfolding the way it did is not evidence for or against any theory. Let's look at how crazy that conclusion is with a concrete event from history as an example, the Holocaust. If the Holocaust did not happen, history would have been so different due to the butterfly effect that I would certainly not exist. So in a way, the Holocaust would be necessary for my existence and is required for me to observe anything, and therefore cannot be evidence for or against any position. So the probability of naturalism is not affected by the Holocaust, and the probability of theism is not affected by the Holocaust. But if the Holocaust doesn't affect the probability of theism, then there is no problem of evil. We don't need a theodicy or some explanation of this particular evil. It's just automatically written off because of the personal anthropic principle. This same reasoning disqualifies virtually all evils that occur prior to my conception. Or rather, your conception. This is, of course, person-centric. Now, one can still run a problem of evil based off of the evils that occur after one's conception. Those can all count against theism. So, it turns out that the effectiveness of the problem of evil is largely dependent on one's age. For young people, there's not a lot of evil that factors into the equation. For old people, there's a bunch of evil. So, for young people at least, maybe a personal anthropic principle can help theism more than hinder it. Although, it might also cause some problems for any argument based on the resurrection of Jesus. The naturalist could simply agree that Jesus rose bodily from the dead. For the personal anthropic principle would certainly write off this miracle. If Jesus hadn't risen bodily from the dead, then history would have been so different that it would ensure that they themselves wouldn't have existed. So, Jesus' resurrection, or any miracle prior to one's conception for that matter, is necessary for oneself to make any observation, and therefore not evidence against naturalism or for theism. Miracles can only be evidence for God if they occur after one's conception. I hope all of this illustrates the problems one might have with the personal anthropic principle, and that, by extension, it casts some doubt on the corporate version of it as well. But that's the end of this video. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe and support me on Patreon if you enjoyed this content.